2020, or How I Learned to Stop Worrying and Survive Global Unrest, also known as an artistic research presentation by Jillian Adamson. I have always found the dissemination of my research process to be an extremely daunting task. It feels so unnatural to translate into words things that I usually do without thinking about them much. Because I find this difficult to break down, I think I'll begin with what might sound like a bit of a non sequitur, but bear with me though. With any luck, it will make sense in the end. Although not exactly at the level of Augusten Burroughs' memoir Running with Scissors, my childhood was a chaotic whirlwind of instability. Without going into unneeded detail, the lack of parental guidance often meant that my little sisters and I were left to fend for ourselves. Although I suspect we understood that our lives were unlike that of other children, we didn't appear to notice it at the time, and did all of the usual things that kids in that situation usually do. We made up games. We tried to get lost in the woods that surrounded our rural Minnesotan home. We were perpetually covered in mud, and most of all, we would build forts. Indoor forts, outdoor forts, tree forts, forts dug out of the ground and covered with plywood, forts made from stolen timber, and forts made out of the random bits and pieces of broken junk that we dug out of the personal landfill a former owner of our home had dug and thrown things into. I understand now, of course, that the forts were our way of building a kind of home that was just ours, that they were a safe refuge from the chaos inside the family home. But at the time, we simply saw them as a place to play. Our forts were places where we figured out how to make curtain poles for the windows of our playhome out of an old towel and twine, to make doors from plywood held up by hinges constructed from the springs of an old rusty sofa frame, and to build an oven out of discarded metal coffee cans. We discovered exactly why flues and chimneys are important during that little experiment. But, long story short, we made so many things out of just about nothing. Come to think of it, something that I've only just come to realize through the writing of this presentation is that my continuing attraction for working with almost exclusively with materials that I happen to have to hand stems directly back to this period of my life. My childhood attempts to make sense of my chaotic environment continue to inform and influence my research process to this day. My research process has grown a bit since my days of sticks and string and random junk, but after a bit of reflection, it really hasn't changed as much as I would have thought. Although I do all of the usual things that students are supposed to do, things such as researching other artists, reading about art theory, reading art history, going to galleries, etc., the bulk of my research is derived from personal experience. Despite being aware that looking up processes and reading about how to do something is helpful, I've come to find that trial and error are priceless tools when it comes to learning. I do, of course, read step-by-step instructions and watch YouTube tutorials about processes that I've never tried before. But reading and watching others do something is nothing compared to the experience of actually doing something, discovering you absolutely suck at it, and then trying something else and coming up with an entirely different way of doing it altogether. Although unaware of it at the time, this method of trial and error has reigned supreme throughout the pandemic as a result of the lockdown restrictions placed on people like me who are on the shielding list. Even before the onset of COVID-19, I was struggling to find my way due to circumstances out with my control. When we went into hard lockdown, this only grew worse. Not really knowing how to handle things, I fell back on my logistics management background and did my best to take care of my husband's and my immediate surroundings. Much to my chagrin, I now recognize that with few exceptions, I fell very naturally into the traditional female gender role. Domesticity has been my unwished-for safety blanket, making sure we had needed household supplies, that our kitchen was well stocked, that we had an active yeast culture, that we were fed, and ultimately, that we were safe, kept me sane. To relax in the evenings, I began to write short entries about my days in lockdown, and as I had the supplies to hand, decided to try to get better at embroidery by embroidering my entries on fabric. This venture was short-lived as I quickly grew disheartened by how long it took me to complete a single entry. The growing backlog of unembroidered days became a recurrent visual display of my inadequacies as an artist. I tried weaving baskets too, But that venture was abruptly cut short when George Floyd was murdered on the 25th of May by Minneapolis police, only a few blocks away from from the last home that I had in Minneapolis, and where many of my friends, as well as my daughter, still live. To say that I couldn't think about anything else is an understatement. Watching armored personnel carriers trundle past my own old flat as the National Guard was brought in, seeing photographs of my friend Sarah after she was assaulted by the police on her way home, seeing my friend Tony, who was only trying to protect his business from rioters, end up being interviewed on both CNN and CNBC, watching endless live streams of what was happening. And most of all, as I was watching those streams, seeing a young woman who I watched grow up talk about getting maced by police when she was only there serving as a medic, and being entirely helpless to do anything to help her because I'm 4,000 miles away.
You want to talk about this?
Apparently I'm getting maced for trying to help people. Apparently I'm helping. I haven't incited any violence. I haven't thrown anything at any officer. I haven't done anything besides help wounded citizens, and I'm getting maced in the fucking face.
What made you come out here to provide mutual aid?
It's part of what you do. You take fucking care of your fellow man.
Anything else you want to say?
Fuck cops. This is how they think they can treat citizens. They can go fucking rot in hell. They're part of an institutionalized racist society that they decided to sign up for.
So, I packed up all of my supplies, made a huge protest sign to put in my window, and decided to focus on taking care of my mental health by crocheting mindless, calm granny squares. I feel like I need to insert another non sequitur to lighten the mood a bit. Another thing that I've been doing throughout lockdown is listening to a lot of audiobooks and lecture series, primarily science fiction novels and lectures about ancient Rome and the Roman Empire. I even named my sourdough starters after emperors. I love to read, but I'm a painfully slow reader as a result of being dyslexic. However, when I discovered audiobooks in 2005, it was a revelation. I now devour books as quickly as I can. I love reading so much that I would rather be blind than deaf, because with audiobooks, I can escape into another world, be someone else, and feel things that have nothing to do with anything going on in the real world. They're not necessarily what the more erudite would consider good books, but long story short, I listen to a lot of books. In his memoir handbook on writing, simply titled On Writing, Stephen King wrote, "Books are uniquely portable magic. I usually listen to one in the car and carry another wherever I go. You just never know when you'll want an escape hatch. Mile-long lines at toll booth plazas, the 15 minutes you have to spend in the hall of some boring college building, waiting for your advisor to come out so you can get a signature on a drop card, airport boarding lounges, laundromats on rainy afternoons, and the absolute worst, which is the doctor's office when the guy is running late and you have to wait a half an hour in order to have something sensitive mauled. At such times, I find a book vital. If I have to spend time in purgatory before going to one place or the other, I guess I'll be all right, as long as there's a lending library." I know that a lot of people dismiss King because he writes for the masses, but in this instance, I couldn't agree with him more. Outside of my family, books are easily one of the most important things in my life, because without them, I would be stuck in the horrible dystopic reality of this world. I'll be the first to admit that I mainly use audiobooks to escape. However, I have discovered that the stories and lectures that I listen to influence me in ways that bleed into my practice. In his memoir, King also mentioned that reading is the creative center of a writer's life. In my case, I think artist could easily be substituted for writer. Books inform me in ways that I often don't realize until much, much later. I transcribe and save excerpts and quotations that I find particularly moving or poignant, and often look back upon them when something in my own life brings a memory of them to the surface. Okay, now that I have that non sequitur about how much books influence me out of the way, I can get back to where I was going when I mentioned the granny squares, and about how escaping into a world of domesticity has kept me sane throughout the pandemic and this seemingly endless period of global unrest. Although I have absolutely no background with sewing, I knew that we would need masks, so I dusted off the sewing machine that I've been lugging around for nearly a decade but never using, and began to try to teach myself how to sew. I was a bit of an uphill battle at first, but I slowly got better, and now I'm actually pretty good at making masks. As much as I don't want to admit it, My growing sewing skills have only contributed to the somewhat unnerving reality of my conforming almost painlessly into the traditional female gender role, at least when it comes to some household tasks. As already mentioned, I've been struggling for quite some time to find any creative inspiration whatsoever. This didn't change with the advent of the new term, so when I contemplated about what I wanted to do, I decided to think about what I have been doing and how that could possibly be incorporated into my practice. And the first thing that came to mind was sewing. How best to do that, though? After all, beyond 100 masks or so, I have very little experience with sewing. I mean, for the most part, I grew up in a rural American township filled with boring beige people who made boring beige things out of fabric, but nobody in my immediate family made anything with a sewing machine. My mother did county cross stitch on occasion, but it was never an obsession, and she always followed a pattern, so trying to tie in something from my past was a bit of a dead end. And then it occurred to me that I was being a bit daft. Before the pandemic hit and truncated the end of the term, I'd been doing a lot of research into craftivism for a paper that I had planned to write for visual culture component of the course. Not only that, but for some strange reason, I was also listening to Jo's Boys, the third book in Louisa May Alcott's Little Women series. As Alcott was a New England transcendentalist, the following thoughts suddenly came crashing together. Global pandemics, institutional racism, activism, transcendental feminism, domesticity, self-care, crafts versus fine art, and sewing. So obviously, all of that points directly to me needing to teach myself how to quilt, right? I mean, duh. Anyhow, wish me luck.